Eleanor Mitchell stood in the center of the bustling courtroom, a hunched silhouette of what she once was. At 76, her trembling hands gripped a weather cane, the only thing keeping her upright besides sheer will. The same hands that had once expertly sutured wounds under enemy fire in Vietnam now struggled to button her threadbare coat. The irony wasn't lost on her. 40 years ago, she had saved hundreds of soldiers as an Army combat nurse and physician. Today, she faced a judge as a common thief. Eleanor had once stood tall in her Army uniform, a beacon of hope to wounded soldiers. The Silver Star and Purple Heart medals she'd earned were tucked away in the lining of her coat, the last treasures she couldn't bear to part with. Her sparse white hair, once hidden under a combat helmet, now revealed a scalp spotted with age. Deep wrinkles mapped a face that had witnessed too much death, too much suffering. Robert had been by her side through it all. They'd met in the field hospital. He a wounded Marine, she a nurse who refused to let him die despite the shrapnel embedded in his chest. After the war, they'd married, built a modest life together. But Eleanor's war never truly ended. The PTSD claimed her sleep. The leg she'd lost in mortar fire left her in constant pain. Robert had become her caretaker, her anchor to reality when the nightmares came. "You saved everyone else," he'd whisper during her darkest moments. "Let me save you now." For 20 years, Robert had been her fortress against the demons. Then cancer took him, slowly, mercilessly, while Eleanor watched helplessly, the way she'd watched too many young men die in Vietnam. The medical bills devoured their savings. The mortgage fell behind. In his final days, Robert had made her promise. "The house on Cedar Street," he'd whispered, his voice paper-thin. "Donate it to the veterans' shelter when I'm gone. They need it more than we do." Eleanor kept her promise. After the funeral, she signed over their home to the local veterans organization, packed what little remained into a duffel bag, and walked away. The VA benefits that should have sustained her had stopped coming years ago, lost in a system that often overlooked female veterans, especially older ones. Paperwork misfiled, appointments missed due to Robert's treatments. The bureaucracy had no mercy for a woman who had shown nothing but mercy to others. For 3 years, Eleanor drifted through Mapleton, a ghost in her own hometown. She never begged. The Army had taught her resilience, if nothing else. She collected aluminum cans, did mending for whoever would pay, and slept in the church shelter when the winter grew too fierce for the park bench she usually claimed. Some of the downtown shopkeepers recognized her, not as the decorated combat nurse she'd been, but as a quiet old homeless woman who never caused trouble. Occasionally, someone who knew of her service would buy her coffee, slip her a few dollars. Eleanor accepted these kindnesses with quiet dignity, her back still soldier straight despite the pain that curved her spine. But this December had been crueler than most. The temperature had plummeted to single digits for a week straight. The arthritis in her remaining leg and the phantom pain in the missing one had become unbearable. Her medication had run out 3 days ago. Without it, she couldn't sleep, could barely think through the fog of pain. Eleanor Mitchell had saved countless lives under enemy fire. Now her own life was slipping away, one frozen night at a time. The fluorescent lights of Walker's pharmacy buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the shelves of medicine that seemed to mock Eleanor. Her VA prescription for pain medication had been denied. Again, some computer error. They'd said it would take weeks to resolve. Weeks she didn't have. The tremors in her hands had worsened, and the phantom pain in her missing leg screamed with every heartbeat. 3 nights without sleep had left her disoriented, desperate. She'd used her last $5 for a cup of coffee that morning, just to stay warm for a few hours in the diner. Eleanor moved slowly through the aisles, leaning heavily on her cane. The store was nearly empty. Just a young cashier scrolling through her phone and an elderly couple examining vitamins. No one paid attention to the stooped old woman in the faded coat. The medication she needed sat on a shelf behind the counter, but there on the open shelves was an over-the-counter alternative. Not as effective, but better than nothing. Eleanor's gnarled fingers reached out, then hesitated. In 76 years, she had never stolen anything, not even in Vietnam, where hunger had been a constant companion. Just this once. she whispered to herself, glancing at the $22.99 price tag that might as well have been $2,299, just to get through the night. With trembling hands, she slipped the small box into her coat pocket. The weight of it felt like a grenade. She turned toward the exit, her cane tapping softly on the linoleum. "Ma'am? Excuse me, ma'am." The young cashier's voice cut through the store. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The manager appeared from the back room, his face hardening when the cashier pointed at Eleanor. "Empty your pockets," he demanded, loud enough for the elderly couple to turn and stare. "I can explain," Eleanor began, her voice thin with shame. "Save it for the police," the manager snapped, already dialing on his phone. "We've had enough of you people stealing from hard-working businesses." The officers arrived within minutes. A young man with a military haircut and an older woman whose eyes softened slightly when she noticed the edge of Eleanor's veteran's ID card peeking from her wallet during the search. "You served?" The female officer asked quietly as she helped Eleanor into the patrol car, mindful of her prosthetic leg. Eleanor nodded once, her eyes fixed on the pavement. "Army nurse. Vietnam." For a moment, something like respect flashed across the officer's face. But procedure was procedure. The handcuffs clicked shut, biting into Eleanor's arthritic wrists. That night in the holding cell, Eleanor sat on the thin mattress, her back against the cold wall. From inside her shirt, she withdrew a small photograph. Robert in his Marine uniform, young and strong, his arm around a nurse in combat fatigues. Both smiling, both whole. "I'm trying, Robert," she whispered. "I'm still trying." The Mapleton Municipal Court smelled of floor polish and desperation. Eleanor shuffled through the security checkpoint, her prosthetic leg making her gait uneven and slow. The bailiff, a young man with kind eyes, didn't rush her. Without her cane, which had been confiscated during booking, she felt naked, vulnerable. "Take your time, ma'am," he said quietly, offering his arm for support. The courtroom was moderately full, mostly petty offenders, public defenders shuffling papers, a few bored reporters. Eleanor was placed in the front row of seats. Her threadbare coat hung from her thin frame, her white hair uncombed. She looked like exactly what she was, an elderly homeless woman awaiting judgment. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Henry Collins," the bailiff announced. Eleanor struggled to her feet, wincing as her weight shifted to her prosthetic leg. Judge Collins entered, a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had once worn a uniform himself. The morning docket proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Drunk drivers, petty thieves, public nuisance cases, all processed, sentenced, and dismissed within minutes. Finally, the clerk called case number 22 to 487, State versus Eleanor Mitchell. Eleanor rose again, slower this time. The prosecutor, a young woman with tired eyes and a stack of identical files, barely looked up as she recited the charges. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught shoplifting medication valued at $22.99 from Walker's Pharmacy. She has no fixed address and limited identification. The state recommends 30 days, suspended with community service." Judge Collins glanced at the file, then at Eleanor. Something in his expression shifted. The smallest furrow of his brow, a slight tilt of his head. "Ms. Mitchell, do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" he asked, his tone professionally neutral. Eleanor straightened her shoulders despite the pain. Old habits die hard. "No excuses, Your Honor. I needed medication for my leg. I couldn't afford it. I made a bad choice." Judge Collins nodded, then flipped through the arrest report. Something small slipped from between the pages. A laminated card that clattered onto his bench. He picked it up, studied it for a moment. It was Eleanor's military ID, worn around the edges but still legible. "You served?" he asked, his voice suddenly different. "Yes, Your Honor. Army Nurse Corps, later field physician. 1967 to 1975. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Vietnam?" "Yes, sir. 3rd Field Hospital, then MASH unit near Pleiku." Something flashed across Judge Collins' face. Recognition, disbelief, then a dawning realization. He leaned forward, studying Eleanor's face more carefully. "Were you stationed at Firebase Oriole in early '68? His voice had lost its judicial detachment. Eleanor's breath caught. "January through March, yes." Judge Collins stood abruptly, the sudden movement causing a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. "This court will take a 15-minute recess. Ms. Mitchell, please remain." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. As the judge disappeared into his chambers, whispers circulated through the courtroom. The prosecutor looked confused, the bailiff intrigued. Eleanor simply stood there, leaning against the defendant's table for support, wondering what had just happened. Inside his chambers, Judge Henry Collins pulled an old photograph from his wallet. A much younger version of himself lay on a stretcher, bandaged and bloody. Beside him stood a young nurse with determined eyes and blood-stained hands. The same woman who now stood in his courtroom, bent by age and circumstance, but unmistakably the same. "Dr. Mitchell," he whispered to himself. "The angel of Pleiku." He reached for his phone, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed. "Get me General Patterson at the VA," he said. "It's about one of our own." When Judge Collins returned to the courtroom, he was a different man. The formal judicial demeanor had been replaced by something more urgent, more personal. Behind him trailed his clerk, arms full of hastily printed documents. "This court will come to order," he announced, but his eyes never left Eleanor. The prosecutor sensed a shift in atmosphere. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," Judge Collins interrupted, uncharacteristically terse. "Ms. Mitchell, please approach the bench." Eleanor made her way forward slowly, painfully aware of every eye in the courtroom following her halting progress. "Ms. Mitchell," the judge began, his voice now pitched for her ears alone. "Do you remember a young Army specialist brought into Firebase Oriole on February 12, 1968? Multiple shrapnel wounds, severed artery, given less than a 10% chance of survival?" Eleanor blinked, momentarily confused. Then understanding dawned in her tired eyes. "You," she whispered. "The boy with the chest wound. They wanted to black tag you." Judge Collins nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You operated for 6 hours straight, under mortar fire. You refused to evacuate." "I remember," Eleanor said softly. "You kept apologizing for bleeding on my boots." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor sat frozen, file half open on her table. Judge Collins cleared his throat. "This court is now in recess until tomorrow morning. Ms. Mitchell will be released on her own recognizance." The gavel came down before anyone could object. While bailiffs cleared the courtroom, Judge Collins made a phone call, then another, and another. By midnight, his chambers had become a war room. Veterans Affairs officials, military record specialists, and the district attorney himself had all received personal calls from the judge. What they discovered was unconscionable. Eleanor Mitchell had not just served. She had distinguished herself repeatedly. Silver Star for valor under fire. Purple Heart for injuries sustained saving her patients during a direct hit on her field hospital. Bronze Star with oak leaf clusters. After losing her leg, she had fought to remain in service, becoming one of the few female physicians in the combat zone. Yet her benefits had been systematically denied since Robert's death. Address changes that never processed. Appointments scheduled but notices sent to obsolete addresses. Appeals lost in the system. A decorated combat veteran and physician reduced to homelessness through bureaucratic indifference and systemic failure. By morning, the courtroom was packed. News had spread quickly in the small military town. Veterans in their service caps sat in silent rows. Active duty personnel stood at the back, drawn by the whispered story of the homeless hero. When Eleanor entered, escorted not by a bailiff but by Judge Collins himself, a hush fell over the crowd. She looked bewildered by the attention, clutching her return cane with white-knuckled intensity. "All rise," the bailiff announced, though most were already standing. Judge Collins took his seat and addressed the court. Yesterday, a grave injustice was brought to light in this courtroom. Before us stands not a common thief, but Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Mitchell, one of the most decorated combat nurses in Army history. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor," in light of new information, the state moves to dismiss all charges with prejudice. So ordered, Judge Collins replied, but he wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court has been in contact with the Department of Veterans Affairs. Colonel Mitchell's benefits are being reinstated immediately, with full back pay from the date of termination. A silver-haired man in an impeccable suit stood from the gallery. The VA acknowledges our failure in Colonel Mitchell's case and extends our deepest apologies. A check for $237,000 in back benefits has been prepared, along with immediate enrollment in our medical program and housing assistance. Eleanor swayed slightly, steadying herself against the table. I don't understand, she whispered. It means you're going home, Colonel. Judge Collins said, his judicial formality cracking. It means America remembers, even when its systems fail. As if on cue, the veterans in the gallery rose as one. Their salutes, some crisp, some wavering with age, cut through the air like a physical force. Eleanor Mitchell straightened her bent spine as much as she could and, balancing on her cane, returned their salute with trembling dignity. For the first time in years, Eleanor Mitchell was visible again, not as a homeless old woman, but as the hero she had always been. A commotion at the back of the courtroom drew everyone's attention. A woman in her 40s pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears. "Mom," she called, her voice breaking. "Mom, is that you?" Eleanor turned, disbelief etched across her weathered features. "Sarah?" The woman rushed forward, ignoring the bailiff's half-hearted attempt to stop her. She threw her arms around Eleanor, nearly toppling them both. "I've been searching for years," Sarah sobbed against Eleanor's shoulder. "After Dad died, you just disappeared. The house was sold, your phone disconnected. Nobody knew where you'd gone." Eleanor's arms slowly, hesitantly encircled her daughter. I thought you were better off without me. The nightmares, the drinking after your father died. I was ashamed." "I never stopped looking," Sarah whispered fiercely. "Never." Judge Collins allowed the reunion to continue for a moment before gently clearing his throat. "If there's no objection, this court is adjourned." The gavel fell softly, almost reverently. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's story spread beyond Mapleton. National news picked it up. The decorated female combat veteran who had saved countless lives only to be forgotten by the very system she had served. Her case became a catalyst for change, prompting a full review of how the VA processed claims for female veterans, especially those from the Vietnam era. Eleanor moved into a small apartment provided through the newly established Veterans Housing Initiative. With Sarah's help, she began physical therapy for her long-neglected injuries. The phantom pain would never fully disappear, but proper medication made it manageable for the first time in years. 1 month after her court appearance, Mapleton held a ceremony in the town square. American flags lined the streets, and a military band played as Eleanor, dressed in a new suit with her medals properly displayed, was escorted to the podium by Judge Collins. Colonel Mitchell didn't just save lives in Vietnam. The judge told the assembled crowd, "She saved mine, and in doing so, she allowed me to become the person standing before you today." When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she rose slowly, leaning on her new cane, a gift from a group of local veterans, handcrafted from polished oak with an Army Medical Corps emblem inlaid at the top. "I didn't serve for recognition," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "I served because there were young men dying who deserved a chance to come home. But when I needed help, I became invisible." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Don't let others become invisible. See them. Remember them. The wounds of war don't always show, and they don't heal when we turn away. After the ceremony, Eleanor sat on a bench in park, the same bench where she had once slept on warmer nights. Sarah sat beside her, holding her hand. A service dog, provided by a veterans organization, rested at her feet. Was it worth it? Sarah asked quietly. All those years in the war, after what it cost you? Eleanor looked at the children playing nearby, at the families enjoying the peace of an ordinary day. She thought of the young men she'd fought to save, of Judge Collins and the life he'd built, of the changes now happening because her story had finally been heard. It was worth it, she said softly. And now, perhaps, Others like me won't be forgotten. In her pocket, she carried Robert's photograph, worn smooth by decades of handling. She wasn't alone anymore. As the evening sailed around them, Eleanor Mitchell looked up at the emerging stars and felt, for the first time in many years, that she had finally come home. What do you think we should do to better honor and support those who sacrifice for our country, especially female veterans? Share your thoughts and respect in the comments.